The Bank of England has stood on Threadneedle Street since 1734. With such a long history, you'd expect it and the area to be haunted. Indeed, the square mile packs a lot of human activity into a relatively small space. The Black Nun of Threadneedle Street is a favourite story on ghost walks around the City of London. But is it entirely accurate? Is there any truth to the story? To what extent is this spirit being confused with the Old Lady of Threadneedle Street, a nickname for the bank itself? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host Icy Sedgwick. We are rattling through spooky season, otherwise known as October, and I do have another ghost story for you this week, and we are staying in London because, let's face it, it is one of the older settlements in the country, and obviously if you have that much human activity in one place, it's bound to leave some kind of imprint on the environment around it. So we're going to go to the City of London, and the City of London is a little bit of a weird concept anyway, because it is the square mile that comprises the City of London, not to be confused with Greater London, which is pretty much everything else. So we are going to head to the City of London and we're going to have a look at Threadneedle Street. Now, why exactly is Threadneedle Street important to this story? Well, it got its unusual name in 1598, having previously been part of Broad Street, but it's important because it's also the site of the Bank of England. Now, the Bank of England was actually founded in 1694 during the reign of King William III. The bank is actually the world's second oldest central bank after the Swedish Riksbank, which was founded in 1688. Now anyway, war with France was draining William's coffers and two merchants agreed to found a national bank to lend money to the government. The money would finance the war, while taxes on alcohol and shipping would pay for the interest on the loan. And thus the bank was born. Now, its original location was actually in the Mercer's Hall on Cheapside, and then George Sampson designed the original bank building on Threadneedle Street because they obviously needed room to expand. Meanwhile, Sir John Soane designed the next building for the Bank of England, and in 1830 the artist Joseph Gandy painted an absolutely exquisite watercolour of the bank in ruins, which you can see if you go to the blog post for this episode. You can also see this gorgeous painting in the Soane Museum in Lincoln Inn's Fields as well if you're in the area. Now later on, Sir Herbert Baker demolished Soane's version in 1925 to build a new Bank of England building. But we do need to go back to 1797 because there are two things happening at the same time which essentially lead to this story of the Black Nun of Threadneedle Street. So in 1797, James Gilray produced a satirical cartoon that portrayed the bank as an old lady dressing banknotes and sitting on a chest of gold. William Pitt the Younger makes unwanted advances. Now, this cartoon was important because a financial crisis was raging at the time, and the bank didn't use gold to back the issue of paper notes. Richard Sheridan, Member of Parliament and playwright, referred to, and I quote, an elderly lady in the city of great credit and long standing who had made a faux pas and had unfortunately fallen into bad company, end quote. And many people believe this description inspired the cartoon, which was entitled Political Ravishment or the Old Lady of Threadneedle Street in Danger. Clearly, the idea behind the cartoon was to have a go at the way that the government was essentially ravishing the Bank of England at a time of financial problems. Obviously a catchy name, as in the Old Lady of Threadneedle Street, stuck, and the bank then became personified as this old lady, and some people still refer to that now. Now this is important because this also leads us to our ghost story. And while the Old Lady of Threadneedle Street actually refers to the Bank of England, some people do actually use the title to refer to the ghost in the area. Now the figure is more popularly known as the Black Nun of Threadneedle Street, or sometimes the Bank Nun. So to find out who she is, we need to go back to the 19th century. And this obviously was a period in which many crimes were punishable by death. It's also the same period that sees the bank not providing gold to back paper money. So in 1811, a man named Philip Whitehead worked in the cashier's office at the Bank of England. And in November 1811, the authorities charged him with forgery and they hanged him for this crime in 1812. Now, I do want to point out at this point that forgery was really common during the restriction period, which was between that date I mentioned earlier of 1797 and 1821. And what had happened was there was an overprinting of banknotes that caused a shortage of gold, and as a result, the Bank of England temporarily didn't have to exchange notes for gold. So the bank began issuing notes for £1 and £2 to compensate for the gold shortage. And this made forgery an ideal crime because those now handling paper currency weren't always used to it. They were often illiterate and couldn't necessarily recognise fake notes. Therefore, forgery the ideal thing to do in such a circumstance. Now, forging banknotes actually became a capital offence, and over 300 people were hanged for doing so during the restriction period. So this is something that we need to bear in mind when we read the story about Philip Whitehead being hanged for forgery in 1812. But Philip also had a sister named Sarah, and in some versions of the legend, she took the news of his offence and execution extremely badly, and she continued to visit the bank every day, always asking to see Philip and always turned away disappointed. According to the story, Sarah dressed in black and wore a black veil, which earned her the nickname the Black Nun. Now, in other versions of the story, no one actually bothered to inform her of his hanging at all, and in this version, she arrived at the bank one day and asked to speak to her brother, something she'd no doubt done many times before. A clerk told her of Philip's fate, not realising who she was, and Sarah therefore took the news badly of her brother's death, and something inside her snapped, as I imagine it would if the news was broken to you in such a fashion. As with the other version of the story, she then continued to turn up at the bank every day to ask for Philip, even though obviously by this point she knew what had happened to him, but she still continued to ask for him nonetheless. When the clerks turned her away, she sometimes accosted customers instead, always asking after her brother. Eventually, the bank officials, tired of her behaviour, worried about the effect it might have on the bank's reputation, and in 1818 they paid her to stay away. Now, to give her her due, reports suggest that she actually did so for the remainder of her life. Now, Sarah died in 1840 and she was buried in St Christopher le Stock's churchyard, and in later years the Bank of England then absorbed the churchyard when the bank expanded. But here's the thing, Sarah apparently doesn't lie quietly, and the proximity of her grave to the bank apparently explains why people see her in the area. A local worker allegedly spotted her pounding the gravestones with her fist in the churchyard. The Black Nun also makes appearances in the nearby bank underground station, and one worker believed he'd spotted an old lady in the station. Given the early hours of the morning, he thought she'd been locked in. He tried to catch up with her, only for her to disappear down a corridor with no exit. Workers sometimes report knocking inside empty lifts after the station closes. There are reports of strange smells, but let's be honest, it is the underground and it would be weird if there weren't any smells. Now, the common point of any sightings of Sarah all revolve around the same thing, that somebody is stopped by a woman dressed in black who asks if they know where her brother is or if they can find her brother. And then the person often goes to help, and then when they look back, she's gone. And this is apparently the way that she generally appears. And when I actually did a ghost walk in March 2013 in the area, the guide told us his tale about Sarah. And he claimed that he told the story to a previous tour group about Sarah and the idea that she was wandering the streets around the bank, and one of the tourists turned white. The guide naturally asked what was wrong, and the tourist, an American visiting London on business, told him that he'd gone for a walk the previous evening just to have a bit of a look round the city of London. He'd encountered a woman dressed in black who stopped him and asked if he knew where her brother was. The tourist wanted to help but couldn't, obviously not knowing the area or indeed who she was talking about, so he turned to see if anyone else on the street knew of her brother. When he turned back, she'd gone. Obviously, hearing the story about the Black Nun of Threadneedle Street on the tour then made him realise who or what it may have been that he'd encountered in the street. Now, obviously, it is possible that the tour guide made up the story to help sell the legend, and it does sound good all the same, and it matches other reports of sightings in which a woman dressed in black stops passers-by to ask if they know where her brother is. And a lot of the sightings that I actually found when I was reading up on this online, people had been emailing websites to say, I've seen the Black Nun, and all of the stories follow the same thing. They don't know the story in advance, so they're like, I was stopped by this woman, she asked where her brother was, and then she disappeared. And then I found out later about the Black Nun of Threadneedle Street. So it always seems to be that people only see her when they don't know who she is, if that makes sense. Now, I've never seen her myself, but obviously if you ever find yourself in the area and a woman in a black veil stops you to ask after her brother, at least you now know who she is. Now, obviously, because this is fabulous folklore and I do like delving into whether or not there may actually be any truth to the story, I wanted to do so for this one. And it's quite cool because on one hand, There is some truth to it, and on the other hand, we're not quite sure, because ultimately, Philip Whitehead did exist. Now, I checked the British newspaper archives and I actually found a mention of Philip Whitehead from the 12th of November 1811, and this short snippet appeared in the Cumberland Packet and Ware's Whitehaven Advertiser, as I say, from 1811. And the article says, and I quote, "Philip Whitehead was indicted for forging or uttering, knowing it to be forged, the acceptance of Thomas Gullen, livery stable keeper, King Street, Westminster, to a bill of exchange for £87 10s drawn by the prisoner on Mr. Gullen and made payable at the banking house of Messrs. Ransom and Co. The jury found the prisoner guilty. Death." End quote. Now, £87 and 10s is a fair bit of money. And in 2017, that amount was worth approximately £4,070 and 96. So here, Philip forged this bill of exchange, or at least knew it was forged when he passed it on, and therefore that was what brought the authorities to his door. And it's notable that it happened during this restriction period between 1797 and 1821, when there was such a harsh crackdown on forgery. So far we do actually have the Bank of England employee being executed for forgery, and in the right time, so that all stands up historically. But then we've got to take Sarah into account, and I did look her up in the archives and I couldn't really find any mention of the one that fits this story. There was loads of Sarah Whiteheads, but not quite the right one. But obviously that doesn't mean that she didn't exist, and there's a reason why I can say that she did. But we're going to have a quick look at the churchyard, because obviously the whole point is the fact that she's buried more or less on the site, and that's why she still wanders in the area. Now, she was supposed to be buried at St Christopher Stocks, and this was actually demolished in 1781 to make way for a bank extension. Now, the authorities reburied those in its churchyard in Nunhead Cemetery between 1867 and 1933. So if Sarah Whitehead was one of the people buried in St Christopher Stocks churchyard, then she wouldn't be buried on the site anymore. Obviously, you have to wonder if the churchyard was still in use up until 1867, even after the church was demolished. Either way, the churchyard then became an enclosed courtyard for the Bank of England. So I must admit, by this point, considering the fact that Sarah didn't die until 1840, and then they started reburying people in Nunhead Cemetery from 1867, I can't help thinking that the tale of the worker witnessing Sarah pounding her headstone in the churchyard is a little bit of wishful thinking. And people did apparently see her in this courtyard, so who knows? Perhaps she was originally buried in the churchyard, but she continues to linger due to the bank's links with her brother, not necessarily where she was buried, because let's be honest, few ghosts actually haunt cemeteries, so why would she go to Nunhead just because her remains had? Now, this is where I think it gets a little bit more interesting, and I then searched the online catalogue for the Bank of England archive, and I found that they actually hold papers about the Black Nun story, which they refer to her as the Bank Nun, and apparently the papers include an account written by Sarah herself, dated December 1837. So that's why I'm like, yes, we can say that there was a Sarah Whitehead. Now, I haven't been able to visit the archive in person to check it out, but when I do, I will do an update. Now, ultimately, what I think we've got going on here is we have this kernel of truth of Philip Whitehead being executed for forgery. So we have that happened. That is an actual thing in the historical record. And then we do have this account written by Sarah Whitehead, which is then held by the bank. So we have these two things that would appear to fit together. The part that's then a little bit less easy to work out is the part about, does Sarah continue to wander the streets in the area looking for her brother? And that is the part that I think where the ghost story itself comes from. So I don't know if it's been retrofitted onto this story of this sad sister who lost her brother, because I do ultimately think that someone probably discovered the story of Sarah Whitehead visiting the Bank of England, and then the legend essentially wrote itself, because it would be so easy to extrapolate a ghost story from the truth, turning a grief-stricken sister with compulsive behaviour into a lost, mournful spirit. Now, obviously, on the other hand, it could be completely true, and if so, this would be a brilliant example of a ghost story in which we can see the original facts that help to explain the existence of the spirit. And I think this is why I find this story so fascinating, because so many ghost stories are really vague. Like, let's have a look at the Grey Man of Bellister from a few weeks ago. We have no idea when that original story was supposed to have happened. No idea whatsoever. When did the Baron kill the guy? We don't know. It's really vague and really non-specific. Whereas here, we've got names, we've got dates, we've got facts that can verifiably checked in the historical record. So if indeed the ghost story is true and the Black Nun of Threadneedle Street is wandering around the streets of the city of London and accosting people asking about her brother, then that is really interesting that we can link that so specifically to this very, very definite period of history. So I think that is what makes this such an interesting story. The fact that she's then also linked with the bank tube station, I think, is really interesting, because for one thing, bank's a weird tube station at the best of times. It's got like 8 exits or something. But I think it's quite fascinating that she would then expand her remit to then wandering around the tube station as well. Now, what I want to know is, who do you think the Black Nun of Threadneedle Street is? Do you think that it is Sarah Whitehead continuing to search for her brother, just completely not accepting the reality that he was executed for forgery? Or do you think that it's a different spirit entirely? Because as I said before, there are so many stories of human occupation on that site going back so far that it is entirely possible that she's actually somebody else and that someone's just conflated 2 legends. Who knows? I would like you to let me know if you have seen her though, because that would be super cool to hear if anyone's actually seen it. If you have, you can drop a comment for the blog post that this episode goes with, and the link is in the show notes below. You can also email me at icy@icysedgwick.com if you'd rather it was more private and it's not then made public. Remember, Sedgwick is Sedgwick, and that would be really cool to hear from you. And I should point out just before we go that if you are fascinated by hauntings of tube stations, I do actually have an entire episode dedicated to railway ghosts and legends in my supporter-only podcast episode. So if you become a supporter at the $3.50 a month tier, you can get access to that. So hopefully you'll be interested in that. Now that is the end of this week's episode. We're going to be back next week for the final instalment in our spooky season October extravaganza. I have also just dropped the first exclusive snippet for my Patreon supporters who are from like the £1.50 a month or any one above that tier. And that is about the ghost of Amy Robsart. So if you're interested in getting little exclusive storytelling based snippets, then feel free to check out the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon as well. I'm going to leave it there though. Remember, I am doing a talk with Cresswell Craggs next Thursday on where Halloween traditions come from, so that the link to book tickets for that is also below, and it will be fabulous to see you there, because let's be honest, it's nearly Halloween and that's exciting. So yeah, I'm gonna shush now because otherwise I'll get excited about the fact it's nearly Halloween again. And I will see you next week for our final instalment in our spooky season on Fabulous Folklore. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.